3000 BCE, the vast, windswept Eurasian steppe. Long before the first stone was laid at Persepolis, long before the name Persia ever echoed through the halls of history, the story of this civilization began not in the fertile valleys of the plateau, but in the endless, rolling grasslands of the north. To understand the soul of the Persian Empire, we must first look to the horizon of the steppes, to a time of nomadic movement, horsemen, and the slow, grinding march of peoples across a continent. For centuries, the ancestors of the Persians were not a settled nation, but a collection of highly mobile, pastoralist tribes. These were the Indo-Iranians. They were a people defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the requirements of their livestock. They were masters of a new, revolutionary technology that would change the face of warfare and migration forever: the domestication of the horse and the invention of the spoke-wheeled chariot. As the climate shifted and populations grew, these tribes began to move. They were not an invading army in the traditional sense, but a slow, organic diffusion of culture, language, and blood. Moving south from the Central Asian grasslands, these groups began to splinter. One branch would head toward the Indian subcontinent, becoming the Vedic peoples. Another, more fateful branch would begin a long descent toward the rugged mountains and high plateaus of the Iranian highlands. This was not merely a movement of people, but a movement of ideas. As these tribes migrated, they carried with them a proto-language, an Indo-European tongue that would eventually evolve into the many dialects of the Persian world. They carried with them a shared set of spiritual concepts, a belief in a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, truth and falsehood, light and darkness. This shared mental landscape would eventually find its most profound expression in Zoroastrianism, the faith that would become the spiritual heartbeat of the Persian Empire. As they descended into the Iranian plateau, these nomadic groups encountered a landscape far different from the flat steppes. They met the mountains of the Zagros, the arid deserts, and the fertile river valleys. This transition was a crucible. The hard, nomadic life of the steppe began to clash and merge with the sedentary traditions of the ancient Near East. The warriors of the north were forced to adapt, learning to build permanent settlements, to cultivate the earth, and to organize themselves into more complex social hierarchies. They were no longer just herders following the grass. They were becoming something new. They were becoming the architects of a sedentary civilization. The tribal confederations of the steppe were slowly hardening into the Proto-Iranian kingdoms. The fierce independence of the nomad was being tempered by the necessity of the state. In these early centuries, there are no grand palaces to point to, no written records to read. There are only the echoes of hoofbeats on the grass and the shifting patterns of migration. But in this chaos of movement, the foundation was being laid. The bloodlines were being established. The cultural DNA was being coded. The nomadic wanderers of the Eurasian steppe were beginning their transformation into the masters of the world. The journey had begun. 800 BCE, the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Zagros Mountains. As the nomadic tribes of the steppe finally descended into the heart of the Iranian plateau, the era of wandering was coming to an end. The scattered clans were no longer merely following the seasons. They were claiming the land. And from this fusion of steppe warrior culture and highland geography, a new power began to crystallize. They were the Medes. While the Persians would eventually claim the mantle of world empire, it was the Medes who first broke the silence of the highlands. They were the first of the Iranian peoples to transform from a collection of disparate tribes into a formidable, organized state. Nestled within the formidable natural fortress of the Zagros Mountains, the Medes did something their nomadic ancestors had never dared. They built a center. They established a kingdom that acted as a bridge between the wild, untamed north and the ancient, sophisticated civilizations of the south. For centuries, the great powers of the Near East, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, had dominated the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. To them, the mountain dwellers were often little more than a nuisance, a source of raiding tribes and unpredictable skirmishes. But the Medes were evolving. They were moving beyond the raid, developing a sophisticated political structure that could command the loyalty of various Iranian clans. By the 7th century BCE, the Medes had transitioned from mountain chieftains to true monarchs. They were no longer just masters of the horse and the bow. They were architects of a nascent imperial identity. They began to establish fortified cities and control the vital trade routes that snaked through the mountain passes, connecting the east to the west. This economic control provided the lifeblood for their growing influence. The Medes were a people of dualities. They possessed the fierce, unyielding spirit of the steppe horsemen, yet they were increasingly influenced by the settled, urban traditions of the civilizations they encountered. This synthesis created a unique military and political machine. They were capable of fielding disciplined armies that could challenge the legendary Assyrian war machine, an empire that had long held the world in a state of terror. However, the Median era was defined by a precarious tension. They were a rising sun, casting a long shadow over the Near East, yet they remained a confederation of tribes held together by the strength of their kings. Their power was real, their presence was felt, and their influence was expanding, but they were still carving their identity out of stone and iron. They stood at the threshold of greatness, acting as the vanguard for everything that was to come. The Medes had proved that the Iranian peoples could do more than survive the harshness of the plateau, they could rule it. They had established the template for the Iranian state, the concept of a centralized authority, a mountain-based stronghold, and a warrior aristocracy. But as the Medes rose to challenge the crumbling hegemony of Assyria, they were unknowingly setting the stage for a much larger drama. The mountain fortress of the Medes would soon become the anvil upon which a new, even greater power would be forged. For as the Medes reached for the heights of imperial glory, their own kin, the Persians, were watching from the shadows of the foothills, waiting for their moment to change the course of history forever. 1500 BCE. The windswept plains of Central Asia, shifting toward the Iranian plateau. While the Medes were carving out their political destiny in the mountains, a revolution of a much more profound nature was brewing in the spirit of the Iranian people. It was not a revolution of swords or borders, but a revolution of the soul. For centuries, the Proto-Iranian tribes had lived under a pantheon of many gods, chaotic, often violent deities tied to the elements, the storms, and the hunt. Life was a cycle of appeasement, a constant struggle to satisfy unpredictable spirits through ritual and sacrifice. But in the heart of this ancient world, a man emerged who would shatter the old ways forever. His name was Zarathustra. Whether he was a priest, a warrior, or a wandering sage, his impact was seismic. Zarathustra did not merely propose a new way to worship, he proposed a new way to exist. He claimed to have received a divine revelation, a vision that stripped away the complexity of the old pantheon and replaced it with a singular cosmic clarity. He spoke of one supreme creator, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of wisdom, the source of all that is good, true, and beautiful. With this revelation, the world was no longer seen as a playground for capricious gods, but as a battlefield. Zarathustra introduced a concept that would become the moral backbone of the Persian identity: the eternal, cosmic struggle between light and dark. In this new vision, existence was defined by two opposing forces. On one side stood Ahura Mazda and the Asha, the divine order, truth, and righteousness. On the other stood Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the embodiment of drudge, the lie, chaos, and darkness. This was not merely a myth, it was a call to action. Every human being, from the lowliest shepherd to the highest king, was drafted into this celestial war. Every thought, every word, and every deed was a weapon. To speak the truth was to strengthen the light. To tell a lie was to feed the darkness. To create life and order was to serve Ahura Mazda. To bring destruction and chaos was to serve the lie. This transformed morality from a series of tribal taboos into a cosmic responsibility. It gave the Iranian people a sense of purpose that transcended the survival of the clan. They were no longer just fighting for grazing lands or mountain passes. They were fighting for the very soul of the universe. This dualism, the tension between the luminous and the shadow, would seep into the very marrow of Persian culture. It would influence their laws, their architecture, and their perception of justice. It provided a moral compass that would guide the great empires to follow, teaching them that power was not merely the ability to conquer, but the duty to uphold the truth. As the Medes built their cities and the Persians prepared to claim their throne, they did so under the watchful eyes of these cosmic forces. The religious foundation laid by Zarathustra ensured that when the Persian Empire finally rose to touch the edges of the known world, it would do so not just as a collection of territories, but as a crusade of light against the encroaching dark. 1200 BCE. The high, mist-shrouded peaks of the Alborz Mountains and the sprawling valleys of the Iranian plateau. If Zarathustra provided the moral soul of the Iranian people, then the legends of the Kayanian dynasty provided their epic heartbeat. To understand the Persian identity, one must understand that for them, history and myth were not two separate things. They were a single, flowing river. This distinction is preserved in the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem that serves as the collective memory of a civilization, bridging the gap between the divine and the human. Long before the first stone of Persepolis was laid, the legends speak of the Kayanians, a line of semi-divine kings who embodied the struggle between the light and the lie. These were not merely rulers. They were archetypes of justice, tragedy, and heroism. In the halls of Persian memory, the Kayanians represented the golden age of Iranian sovereignty, a time when the kings were the direct guardians of a Shah, the divine order. The myths tell of kings like Kashapa, who ruled with a wisdom that mirrored the heavens, and the legendary Kayamers, the first man and the first king, who lived in a state of primordial innocence before the shadow of chaos entered the world. But the stories are rarely simple. They are stained with the blood of heroes and the tears of fallen dynasties. Perhaps no figure looms larger in this mythic tapestry than the tragic hero, Rustam. Though he exists in the realm of legend, Rustam is the personification of the Persian spirit, immense, indomitable, and eternally caught in the tension between duty and desire. He is the champion of the Kayanians, a warrior of such staggering strength that he could face demons and dragons alike. Through Rustam, the Iranian people saw their own struggle reflected, the idea that greatness comes with a heavy price, and that true heroism is found in the courage to stand against the darkness, even when the world itself seems to be crumbling. But the Cainian era was also defined by the Great Lie. The legends recount the rise of the usurper Zahak, a figure of pure nightmare. It is said that Zahak, driven by a demonic influence, grew two serpents from his shoulders that required the brains of young men to satisfy their hunger. Zahak's reign was the ultimate manifestation of Drudge, the lie. Under his shadow, the world fell into chaos, and the divine order was severed. The struggle to overthrow Zahak and restore the rightful Cainian line became the ultimate metaphor for the Persian struggle. The constant, agonizing effort to reclaim order from chaos and truth from deception. These stories were more than mere bedtime tales. They were the blueprints for kingship. They taught the future rulers of Persia that a throne was not a seat of privilege, but a sacred burden. To rule was to be a bulwark against the serpent. To lead was to ensure that the light of Ahura Mazda was never extinguished by the darkness of tyranny. As we move from the realm of myth into the dawn of the Iron Age, we see these legends beginning to coalesce into something tangible. The stories of the Cainians were transitioning from the ethereal whispers of poets into the political realities of rising kingdoms. The mythic past was setting the stage for a very real, very human future. The transition from tribal confederations to the first sedentary powers of the ancient world. 1000 BCE. The sun-scorched plains of the Iranian plateau and the rugged foothills of the Zagros Mountains. As the echoes of the Cainian legends began to settle into the collective consciousness of the people, a profound physical transformation was underway. The era of myth was meeting the era of iron. For centuries, the Indo-Iranian tribes had lived as a collection of migratory clans, highly mobile, fiercely independent, and defined by the seasonal rhythms of the steppe. They were masters of the horse and the bow, living in a world of temporary encampments and shifting loyalties. But the dawn of the Iron Age brought more than just a new, harder metal. It brought a new way of existing upon the earth. The transition from nomadic life to sedentary civilization was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, grinding evolution. It began with the mastery of the land. As iron tools became more prevalent, the ability to reshape the environment increased exponentially. The heavy plow, forged from this new, durable metal, allowed for the taming of the stubborn, arid soils of the plateau. Irrigation networks, the lifeblood of any desert civilization, began to stretch like veins across the landscape, pulling life from the seasonal floods and the hidden mountain springs. With the ability to produce a surplus of grain, the very structure of human society began to shift. When a tribe no longer needs to move to survive, they begin to build. They build granaries, they build walls, and eventually, they build cities. The seasonal camp evolved into the permanent settlement, and the settlement evolved into the fortified town. This newfound stability, however, brought a new kind of complexity. In the tribal era, authority was personal, held by a chieftain whose power was derived from his prowess in battle or his wisdom in council. But as populations grew and settled into fixed territories, the old ways of managing people became insufficient. You could no longer govern a sprawling agricultural valley through mere kinship and oral tradition. The rise of the sedentary kingdom required something more robust: administration. It required the codification of laws, the collection of taxes to maintain infrastructure, and the establishment of a standing class of officials to manage the surplus. The tribal confederation, a loose alliance of equals bound by blood and custom, was being replaced by something far more hierarchical and formidable. A new social strata was emerging, the landed aristocracy, the priestly class, and the peasantry. This was the birth of the proto-state. In the shadows of the mountains, small pockets of organized power began to coalesce. These were the early kernels of what would become the great Iranian kingdoms. They were no longer just groups of families following the herds. They were emerging political entities with defined borders, permanent centers of power, and a burgeoning sense of territorial identity. Yet this transition was fraught with tension. The old nomadic warriors, who valued the freedom of the steppe, often clashed with the new sedentary elites, who sought order and control. This friction between the mobile and the settled, between the old tribal ways and the new administrative realities, would become a defining characteristic of the Persian soul. As these early kingdoms took root, they were no longer just fighting for survival against the elements. They were learning the art of governance, setting the stage for the grand political dramas that would soon draw the gaze of the great empires of Mesopotamia. 700 BCE. The fertile, alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the horizon is dominated by the monolithic silhouettes of Nineveh and Ashur. As the Proto-Iranian kingdoms began to solidify within the Zagros Mountains, they found themselves no longer isolated by geography, but instead positioned at the doorstep of a sleeping giant. To the west lay Mesopotamia, not merely a collection of cities, but a terrifying, highly organized machine of war and administration. For centuries, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had cast a long, suffocating shadow over the Near East. They were the undisputed masters of the Iron Age, a civilization built upon the principles of absolute terror, sophisticated siege warfare, and a bureaucratic reach that seemed to touch the very edges of the known world. For the emerging Iranian tribes and the rising Medes, the Assyrians were both a looming threat and a brutal teacher. The relationship was not one of equals, but of a predator and its neighbors. The Assyrian war machine, fueled by a relentless drive for tribute and territorial expansion, frequently spilled over the Mesopotamian borders, descending upon the highland foothills to demand gold, horses, and slaves. To the people of the Iranian plateau, the Assyrians were the personification of an imperial storm, unpredictable, devastating, and seemingly unstoppable. Yet in this period of subjugation and fear, a subtle alchemy was taking place. The very empires that sought to crush the burgeoning Iranian identities were inadvertently providing the blueprint for their future greatness. As the Assyrians moved through the region, they brought with them the sophisticated technology of empire. The Iranians observed the mechanics of the Assyrian military, the disciplined infantry, the specialized chariot corps, and the terrifying use of psychological warfare. They saw how a central authority could command vast distances through a network of messengers and royal roads. More importantly, they witnessed the administrative machinery required to govern a multi-ethnic landscape. The concept of the provincial governor, the systematic collection of tribute, and the use of state-sponsored art to project divine legitimacy were all lessons being written in the blood and stone of Mesopotamia. This was the era of the shadow. The Iranians were not yet the masters of the world, but they were the students of it. They were watching how the great Mesopotamian powers rose to heights of unimaginable splendor, and how they, in turn, became vulnerable to the weight of their own excess. The Assyrian model of empire was a double-edged sword. It offered a path to absolute power, but it also demanded a level of control that was increasingly difficult to maintain. The tension between the highland tribes and the lowland empires created a crucible. The Medes, in particular, began to coalesce not just as a collection of clans, but as a military force capable of resisting the Mesopotamian tide. They were learning to bridge the gap between the nomadic warrior spirit and the sedentary need for structured command. The shadow of Assyria was dark, yes, but it provided the light by which the early Persians and Medes could see the shape of the future. The era of tribal skirmishes was ending. The era of imperial collision had begun. The lessons learned in the shadow of Nineveh would eventually become the foundation upon which Cyrus the Great would build a world. 550 BCE. The rugged highlands of Anshan, in the heart of the Fars region. While the Medes had successfully emerged from the shadow of Assyria to become the dominant power of the Iranian plateau, the Persians remained a smaller, subordinate people. They were a collection of tribes living under the watchful, often heavy-handed hegemony of the Median Empire. To the Medes, the Persians were useful vassals, providers of soldiers and tribute, but they were not peers. This was the status quo of the mid-6th century BCE, a fractured landscape where the dream of a unified Iranian identity was stifled by the very empire that had paved the way for its existence. But the winds of change were blowing from the south. Out of the Persian heartland rose a figure whose name would become synonymous with the very concept of greatness: Cyrus. The ascent of Cyrus was not merely a change in leadership. It was a fundamental shift in the mechanics of power. Legend and history converge here, telling of a young prince who possessed something his predecessors lacked, a vision that transcended tribal loyalty. Cyrus understood that the era of small, warring clans was over. If the Persians were to survive the predatory ambitions of the Mesopotamian plains, they could no longer exist as a mere appendage to the Medes. They had to become a force of their own. The unification of the Persians was the first step in a grander, more dangerous gambit. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, strategic marriages, and a relentless military intellect, Cyrus consolidated the various Persian tribes under a single banner. He transformed a loose confederation of pastoralists and warriors into a disciplined, cohesive political entity. But Cyrus was not content with a local kingdom. He looked north, toward the throne of Ecbatana, the glittering capital of the Medes. The conflict that followed was not just a war of conquest. It was a collision of two different worlds. The Medes were an established imperial power, steeped in the traditions of the Zagros highlands. The Persians, under Cyrus, represented a new, surging energy, a leaner, more ambitious force that sought to integrate rather than simply subjugate. As the Persian armies marched against the Median heartland, the world watched. The campaign was a masterclass in rapid movement and psychological maneuvering. Cyrus did not merely aim to destroy the Medes, he aimed to inherit them. He recognized that to rule a vast territory, one could not rely solely on the sword. One needed the legitimacy of the old order. When the Median defenses finally buckled, the transition of power was as remarkable as the conquest itself. Rather than a scorched earth occupation, Cyrus orchestrated a seamless absorption. He integrated the Median nobility into his new administration, blending Persian vigor with Median structure. In doing so, he achieved something unprecedented: the unification of the Iranian peoples. The Medes and the Persians were no longer two separate entities competing for survival in the shadows of giants. They had become a single, formidable nucleus. The conquest of Media was the spark that ignited the Persian sun. The era of tribal vassalage had ended. The era of the Achaemenid Empire had begun. Cyrus had not just conquered a neighbor. He had forged the foundation of the world's first true superpower. 539 BCE. The sprawling, opulent metropolis of Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. For centuries, Babylon had been the beating heart of the Near East, a city of hanging gardens, towering ziggurats, and immense wealth. But it was also a city under the iron grip of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under the rule of Nabonidus, the city had grown restless. Religious tensions were simmering, and the local priesthood felt alienated from a king who sought to elevate his own celestial interests over the ancient traditions of Marduk. The social fabric was fraying, and the shadow of a new power was lengthening across the desert sands. That power was the Achaemenid war machine. As the Persian armies approached the Ishtar Gate, the world expected a bloodbath. The history of conquest was almost always written in slaughter. Empires typically fell to the sword, their cities looted, their populations enslaved, and their gods humiliated. But Cyrus was not a typical conqueror. He was a student of human nature, a man who understood that a ruler's greatest tool was not the spear, but the consent of the governed. When the Persian forces breached the defenses of Babylon, something miraculous happened. The city did not burn. The streets did not run red with the blood of its citizens. Instead, Cyrus entered the city not as a destroyer but as a liberator. According to the ancient chronicles, Cyrus presented himself to the people of Babylon as a chosen instrument of their own gods. He did not claim to have conquered Babylon through brute force alone. Rather, he claimed that the Babylonian gods themselves had invited him to restore order and righteousness. This was a masterstroke of psychological warfare and political genius. By aligning his conquest with the existing spiritual framework of the city, he neutralized the impulse to revolt. This philosophy found its most enduring expression in what we now call the Cyrus cylinder. This baked clay artifact, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, serves as one of the earliest declarations of human rights in history. In its text, Cyrus proclaimed that he had come to Babylon to restore its temples, to protect its sacred rites, and to return the displaced peoples to their rightful homes. Perhaps most revolutionary was his decree regarding the Jewish people, who had been held in Babylonian captivity for decades. While the Babylonian kings had used exile as a tool of subjugation, Cyrus issued a mandate for their return to Jerusalem, allowing them to rebuild their temple and practice their faith freely. This was the birth of a new imperial doctrine, religious tolerance. Cyrus realized that an empire built on the forced imposition of a single culture was an empire destined to fracture. But an empire that allowed its subjects to retain their customs, their languages, and their gods was an empire that could thrive. He replaced the terror of the tyrant with the stability of the protector. The liberation of Babylon was the moment the Achaemenid Empire transitioned from a regional power to a global civilization. Cyrus had proven that one could rule the world without breaking its spirit. He had established a blueprint for governance that would influence leaders for millennia. That true strength lies not in the ability to crush your enemies, but in the wisdom to integrate them. The sun of Persia was no longer just rising. It was illuminating the entire known world. 522 BCE. The imperial heartlands of Persia, where the shadow of the great king loomed larger than ever. The era of Cyrus the Great had passed, leaving behind an empire of unprecedented scale. But the transition of power is often the moment when the foundations of greatness are most vulnerable to the tremors of instability. Following the death of Cyrus and the turbulent reign of Cambyses' predecessor, the empire faced a crisis of legitimacy. It was into this whirlwind of political intrigue and shifting loyalties that Cambyses' II ascended the throne. If Cyrus was the architect of the empire, Cambyses was to be its expander. He inherited a realm that was stable but arguably too comfortable, a collection of satrapies that had grown accustomed to Persian protection. To secure his legacy and ensure the continued dominance of the Achaemenid line, Cambyses looked toward the west, specifically toward the ancient, fertile, and profoundly sacred Nile Valley. Egypt. For millennia, Egypt had stood as a bastion of independent civilization, a land of pharaohs and divine kingship that had resisted almost every invader. To the Persians, it was the ultimate prize, a gateway to the Mediterranean and a source of immense agricultural wealth. But conquering Egypt would not be a simple march through the desert. It would be a collision of two of the world's most formidable imperial identities. Cambyses understood that a direct assault on the heavily fortified Nile Delta might be suicidal. Instead, he employed a strategy of calculated pressure. He moved his massive armies across the Sinai Peninsula, a grueling trek through shifting sands and harsh terrain that tested the very limits of Persian logistics. As his forces descended upon the Egyptian borders, the psychological weight of the Persian war machine began to fracture the resistance of the local governors. By 525 BCE, the decisive moment arrived at the Battle of Pelusium. In a move that blended military brilliance with a profound understanding of the Egyptian psyche, Cambyses utilized the enemy's own faith against them. Legend tells us that he placed images of the sacred cat, Bastet, before his advancing ranks. To the Egyptian soldiers, to strike at the Persian line was to strike at the divine. The hesitation was fatal. The Persian victory was swift, and the gates of Memphis, the ancient capital, were thrown open. With the fall of Memphis, Cambyses II was proclaimed pharaoh. He had achieved what many thought impossible. He had brought the Nile under the yoke of the Zagros. Yet the triumph of conquest is rarely the triumph of governance. As Cambyses moved deeper into the heart of Egypt, the challenges of empire began to manifest in darker, more complex ways. The sheer distance between the Persian capital and the Egyptian provinces created a vacuum of control. To rule Egypt, one had to not only defeat its armies but also master its complex bureaucracy and appease its deeply entrenched priesthood. Furthermore, the chronicles of history, often written by the Greeks, paint a portrait of a king increasingly unmoored by the pressures of his vast dominion. Stories of religious desecration and erratic behavior began to circulate, casting a shadow over his reign. Whether these accounts were the product of genuine instability or the bitter propaganda of defeated enemies, they highlight the central struggle of the Achaemenid era. The difficulty of maintaining a singular imperial will over a world of diverse and stubborn traditions. Cambyses had expanded the borders, but in doing so, he had inherited a complexity that would test the very soul of the Persian Empire. 522 BCE, the heart of the Persian Empire, where the dust of rebellion and the scent of political upheaval hung heavy in the air. Cambyses II was dead, and with him, the empire teetered on the brink of total fragmentation. The vast territories he had fought so hard to secure, from the Nile to the Indus, were fracturing under the weight of local revolts and dynastic struggles. It was in this moment of absolute chaos that a man emerged from the shadows of the Persian nobility to claim a destiny that would redefine the very concept of a superpower. His name was Darius. Darius was not merely a conqueror. He was a master of systems. While his predecessors had focused on the art of the sword, Darius understood that an empire held together only by force is an empire waiting to die. To rule a world of 1,000 different tongues, gods, and customs, he realized that the Persian crown needed something more permanent than military presence. It needed an infrastructure of control. His first stroke of genius was the formalization of the satrapies. Darius divided the sprawling, unruly territories into provinces, each governed by a satrap, a provincial governor who acted as the king's eyes and ears. But Darius was too wise to rely on a single source of truth. To prevent these governors from becoming too powerful or too corrupt, he instituted a system of checks and balances. He deployed the king's eyes and ears, royal inspectors who traveled the empire independently, reporting directly to the throne. This created a dual layer of authority. The satrap managed the land, but the king's inspectors managed the satrap. Yet, communication is the lifeblood of any administration. How does a command issued in Susa reach the edges of the Mediterranean or the mountains of Bactria before a rebellion can take root? Darius answered this with one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, the Royal Road. Spanning over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, this was not merely a path for merchants, but a high-speed artery for imperial intelligence. Darius established a sophisticated postal system, a precursor to the modern courier service. Along the road, at regular intervals, were relay stations stocked with fresh horses and rested riders. A messenger could traverse the entire length of the empire in a matter of days, a journey that would take a normal traveler months. This meant that the king's will was no longer limited by the speed of a walking soldier. It moved with the lightning velocity of a galloping horse. Through these administrative veins, Darius pumped stability into the body of the empire. He standardized weights and measures, introduced a unified gold coinage known as the daric, and encouraged the flourishing of trade, turning the Persian realm into a cohesive economic engine. Under Darius, the Achaemenid Empire transitioned from a collection of conquered lands into a sophisticated, interconnected machine. He proved that true power does not come from the ability to destroy, but from the ability to organize. He did not just rule the Persians, he managed the world. And as his roads stretched across the continents and his tax collectors moved through the satrapies, the era of the great king began in earnest, an era where the shadow of Persepolis would finally cast a long, organized, and enduring light across the ancient world. 515 BCE, the Marvdasht Plain in the heart of the Fars province. If the royal road was the nervous system of the empire, then Persepolis was its soul. While Susa served as the administrative engine and Babylon the economic hub, Persepolis was something far more profound. It was not built to be a fortress of war, nor a mere residence for a king. It was designed to be a monumental theater of statecraft, a stone-carved manifesto of what it meant to be part of the Achaemenid world. As you approach the massive, rising terrace, the scale of the ambition becomes overwhelming. Here, Darius the Great and his successor Xerxes did not just build a city, they sculpted a vision of cosmic order. The construction of the Apadana, the great audience hall, required the mobilization of the finest craftsmen from every corner of the known world. This was not a coincidence of geography, but a deliberate political statement. Look closely at the reliefs that line the stairways, and you will see the true genius of Persian imperial ideology. In many ancient empires, the art of the conqueror depicted the humiliated, the shackled, and the broken. But in Persepolis, the narrative is different. As you walk the procession ways, you see a parade of nations. The Medes in their flowing robes, the Elamites, the Bactrians, the Indians, and the Egyptians. They are not depicted as slaves, but as dignified participants in a grand imperial harmony. They carry gifts, gold, fine textiles, exotic animals, and precious woods, not as tribute extracted through terror, but as offerings to the great king, who maintained the peace that allowed them to prosper. This was the architecture of power. The Persians understood that to rule a multicultural empire, you could not simply demand submission, you had to offer belonging. By incorporating the artistic styles of the subjects themselves, the Lion of Babylon, the Lotus of Egypt, the column styles of the Ionian Greeks, the Achaemenids created a visual language that was universal. A subject traveling from the fringes of the empire to the heart of Persia would see their own culture reflected in the very walls of the king's palace. It was a brilliant psychological masterstroke. The empire was not an external force crushing them, but a grand structure of which they were an essential part. The architecture itself served to reinforce the divine mandate of the king. Above the bustling halls and the heavy cedar beams of the palace, the image of the Faravahar, the winged symbol of divine protection, watched over the proceedings. It reminded every satrap and every envoy that the king ruled under the watchful eye of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom. To maintain order in Persia was not just a political duty, it was a religious necessity to combat chaos. Persepolis was the physical manifestation of the Pax Persica. It was a place where the diverse threads of humanity were woven into a single, magnificent tapestry. It stood as a testament to a revolutionary idea, that an empire could be held together not just by the edge of a sword, but by the shared splendor of a civilization that celebrated the many under the banner of the one. 490 BCE, the plains of Marathon on the coast of Attica. But the grand harmony of Persepolis was about to face its greatest ideological challenge. While the Achaemenid Empire sought to weave the world into a single tapestry, a small, fractured collection of Greek city-states viewed this expansion not as an invitation to belonging, but as an existential threat to their independence. The collision between the Persian pursuit of cosmic order and the Greek pursuit of autonomy would ignite a conflict that would change the course of Western history. The spark was struck in Ionia. When the Greek cities of Asia Minor rose in rebellion against Persian rule, Darius the Great saw more than a local insurrection. He saw a puncture in the imperial fabric. To Darius, the Greeks were not merely rebels, they were agents of chaos. In response, he dispatched a punitive expedition across the Aegean, a campaign intended to silence the Greek mainland and secure the empire's western frontier. This campaign brought the Persian war machine to the shores of Marathon. The clash was a shock to the ancient world. On one side stood the disciplined, multi-ethnic levies of the great king, supported by the legendary archers of the East. On the other, the heavily armored hoplites of Athens, fighting with a desperate, localized ferocity. Against all expectations, the Athenian phalanx broke the Persian line. It was a tactical shockwave that rippled back to Susa, proving that the empire's reach, while vast, was not invincible. Yet for the Persians, Marathon was not the end, but a temporary setback. The empire's resources were too vast to be deterred by a single defeat. A decade later, the shadow of the Achaemenids returned, not as a punitive force, but as a tidal wave. 480 BCE, the Straits of Thermopylae and the waters of Salamis. Under Xerxes, the son of Darius, the Persian military machine reached a scale never before witnessed. This was no longer a mere expedition. It was a total mobilization of the empire's might. Xerxes marched with an army so vast that, according to legend, they drank rivers dry, accompanied by a navy that sought to turn the Aegean into a Persian lake. The conflict evolved into a brutal duel between land and sea. In the narrow mountain passes of Thermopylae, a small Greek force held the line, turning a strategic necessity into a mythic stand of resistance. But the true theater of war shifted to the waves. At the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian navy, utilizing the cramped geography of the straits, engaged the massive Persian fleet. It was a moment of extreme tension. If the Persian navy prevailed, the Greek cities would fall, and the Mediterranean would become a Persian province. The clash at Salamis was more than a naval engagement. It was a collision of worlds. The Persian fleet, though superior in numbers, struggled to maneuver in the confined waters, falling prey to the more agile Greek triremes. This defeat forced Xerxes to retreat, leaving his commanders to continue the struggle. While the Persian Empire would eventually stabilize and maintain its grip on Ionia, the dream of a total conquest of the Greek heartland was broken. The Greco-Persian Wars did not destroy the Achaemenid Empire, but they did define its limits. They forced the great kings to realize that the architecture of power could not always be imposed upon those who refused to be part of the tapestry. The struggle left behind a legacy of myth, a hardened Greek identity, and a Persian empire that, while still magnificent, would forever look toward the west with a wary, watchful eye. 336 BCE, the imperial heartlands of Susa and Persepolis. The echoes of the Greco-Persian Wars had long since faded into the annals of history, leaving an empire that was, on the surface, as magnificent and sprawling as ever. But beneath the gilded veneer of the Achaemenid court, a slow, systemic decay had begun to set in. The very scale of the empire, a vast, multi-ethnic tapestry stretching from the Indus Valley to the Nile, had become its greatest vulnerability. The administrative genius of Darius the Great had created a machine of unparalleled efficiency, but over the passing centuries, that machine had begun to rust. As the empire entered the mid-4th century BCE, the central authority of the great king began to fray. The satrapies, once loyal provinces governed by the watchful eye of the crown, were increasingly behaving like independent kingdoms. Local governors, or satraps, grew accustomed to the immense wealth and military power at their disposal. They began to prioritize their own regional interests over the mandates of the central throne, leading to a cycle of corruption, tax evasion, and localized rebellions. The royal road, once the artery of imperial unity, became a conduit for whispered conspiracies and the movement of ambitious warlords. This period of internal instability was exacerbated by a series of succession crises. The Achaemenid bloodline, once seen as a divine link between the heavens and the earth, was increasingly marred by palace intrigues, assassinations, and civil wars. Each time a new king ascended the throne, he did so not with the undisputed mandate of his predecessors, but amidst a storm of competing claims. The legitimacy of the crown was being bled dry by the very elites tasked with defending it. By the time Darius III ascended to the throne, he did not inherit a unified superpower. He inherited a fractured mosaic. The empire was a giant with feet of clay. The treasury, once overflowing with the tribute of 100 nations, was being drained by the cost of maintaining internal order and the mounting demands of a bloated bureaucracy. The military, once a cohesive force of diverse but disciplined levies, was increasingly composed of mercenaries and regional militias, whose loyalties were as fickle as the winds of the Zagros Mountains. The fracturing was not merely political, it was structural. The immense distances between the capital and the frontiers meant that communication was slow, and responses to crisis were often too little, too late. The empire had become too large to govern and too complex to hold together through sheer will alone. The central government was fighting a losing battle against centrifugal forces, forces of regionalism, ethnic identity, and administrative rot that were pulling the imperial fabric apart from within. Darius III stood at the center of this storm, a monarch presiding over a sunset. He was a man tasked with holding together a world that was already slipping through his fingers. He looked out from the balconies of Persepolis and saw an empire that appeared eternal, yet he could feel the tremors beneath his feet. The cracks were widening. The internal strife had hollowed out the empire's strength, leaving it vulnerable to a threat that was not yet visible on the horizon, but was already gathering speed in the west. The stage was set, not for a glorious defense, but for a collision that would shatter the ancient world forever. 334 BCE, the shores of the Hellespont. While the Achaemenid Empire struggled to mend its internal fractures, a storm was brewing in the west, a storm born of Macedonian ambition and a singular, unstoppable will. Alexander, the son of Philip II, did not merely seek to raid the fringes of the Persian world. He sought to dismantle it. To the Greeks, he was a liberator. To the Persians, he was the Macedonian thunderbolt, a force of nature that moved with a speed and ferocity that defied the established logic of ancient warfare. Alexander's invasion was not a slow encroachment, but a lightning strike. He crossed the Hellespont with a professional, highly disciplined machine, the Macedonian phalanx, a bristling forest of long sarissa spears, and the companion cavalry, the elite hammer that would shatter any line it touched. The first major collision came at the Granicus River, where Alexander's audacity nearly cost him his life, but his victory there sent a shockwave through the satrapies. The myth of Persian invincibility was bleeding out on the riverbanks. As Alexander pushed deeper into the heart of Asia, Darius III realized that the survival of his dynasty depended on one final, decisive confrontation. He could not win a war of attrition against a man who seemed favored by the gods. He had to crush the Macedonian threat in a single, overwhelming blow. He gathered the full, terrifying might of the empire, hundreds of thousands of infantry, a massive host of cavalry, and the legendary immortals, and marched to the plains of Gaugamela. October 331 BCE, the dusty, sprawling plains of Gaugamela. The scale of the battlefield was unprecedented. Darius had chosen this flat, open terrain specifically to negate the Macedonian advantage, even ordering his engineers to level the ground so his scythed chariots could tear through the Greek ranks. As the two armies faced one another, the sheer disparity was staggering. The Persian host was a sea of diverse colors, languages, and weapons, a mosaic of 1,000 nations. Against them stood the compact, iron-willed wedge of the Macedonians. The battle was a masterpiece of chaos and precision. Darius unleashed his chariots, and the Macedonian line buckled under the onslaught, but the discipline of the phalanx held. Then, the moment of destiny arrived. Alexander, sensing a momentary gap in the Persian line created by the shifting movement of his own cavalry, did something reckless and brilliant. He led his companion cavalry in a concentrated, wedge-shaped charge, driving straight toward the center, straight toward Darius himself. The thunder of hooves and the screams of dying men filled the air as the Macedonian wedge pierced the imperial heart. Seeing the lightning-fast strike aimed at his very throat, Darius III felt the weight of his crumbling empire. The panic was infectious. As the royal standard wavered, the Persian line, massive as it was, began to fracture. The retreat was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a rout. Darius fled the field, leaving his throne, his treasury, and his empire behind in the dust of Gaugamela. The thunderbolt had struck. The Achaemenid sun was setting, and as the dust settled over the plains, the ancient world realized that everything had changed. The era of the great kings was over. The Hellenistic age had begun. January 330 BCE. The high plains of Persepolis. The defeat at Gaugamela had been a death blow, but the physical destruction of the empire was yet to come. As Darius III fled toward the east, pursued by the shadow of the Macedonian, the heart of the Persian world lay exposed. The great king's retreat had left a vacuum, and through that vacuum, Alexander the Great marched, not merely as a conqueror, but as a man possessed by a vision of total dominion. Persepolis was not just a city, it was the psychological anchor of the Achaemenid soul. It was a mountain-carved testament to the concept of Pax Persica. Here, the Apadana Palace stood as a marvel of human achievement, its towering columns adorned with reliefs of 100 nations bringing tribute in a display of eternal unity. To destroy Persepolis was to strike at the very idea of Persia itself. As the Macedonian forces entered the gates, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that oscillated between awe and impending violence. Alexander, initially, treated the city with the reverence due to a fallen titan. He walked through the monumental halls, perhaps mesmerized by the sheer scale of the craftsmanship, the gold-leafed ceilings, and the intricate stone carvings that spoke of centuries of uninterrupted glory. But the air in the imperial capital was heavy with the resentment of 1,000 conquered satrapies and the bitter memory of the Persian wars. Then the spark met the tinder. History has long debated the exact moment the spark was struck. Was it a premeditated act of vengeance, a calculated move by Alexander to signal the definitive end of the Persian era? Or was it the result of a drunken, chaotic revelry, a sudden eruption of Hellenic excess fueled by wine and the intoxicating scent of victory? Regardless of the intent, the result was a nightmare of fire and ash. The flames took hold in the great halls of the palace. The cedar beams, aged and precious, ignited with a roar that could be heard across the plains. The fire raced upward, climbing the massive limestone columns, turning the architectural masterpiece into a funeral pyre. The gold, the silver, and the lapis lazuli that once decorated the walls began to melt, dripping like tears down the faces of the stone guardians. As the night deepened, the sky over Persepolis turned a bruised, hellish crimson. The great treasury, the accumulated wealth of generations of great kings, was consumed by the heat. The magnificent reliefs, the silent, stone witnesses to Persian history, began to crack and crumble under the thermal shock. In a single night of madness and flame, the visual identity of the empire was being erased. When the sun rose over the ruins, the world looked fundamentally different. The smoke from the burning capital drifted across the Zagros Mountains, a signal to every corner of the known world that the old order had perished. The Achaemenid era had not just ended, it had been cauterized. Persepolis, once the radiant center of a multicultural superpower, was now a skeletal ruin of blackened stone. The thunderbolt had not only struck the heart of the empire, it had burned the very memory of its majesty into the earth, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of a lost golden age. June 323 BCE, Babylon. The smoke of Persepolis had long since cleared, but the vacuum left by the fallen Achaemenid Empire had not been filled by stability. It had been filled by a growing, suffocating tension. Alexander the Great, the man who had dismantled the Persian world, lay dead in his palace in Babylon, his body consumed by a fever that left no heir, no successor, and no clear path forward. He had conquered the world, but he had failed to build a foundation that could survive his own mortality. As the king's body was prepared for burial, a silent, predatory gaze fell upon his generals. These were the Diadochi, the successors. They were the men who had bled alongside Alexander, the commanders of his phalanxes, and the masters of his satrapies. They were men of immense ambition, seasoned by decades of relentless warfare, and they had no intention of letting Alexander's vast, fractured empire slip into the hands of a child or a weak regent. The death of the conqueror was the starting gun for a global game of chess played with blood and iron. The struggle did not begin with a single battle, but with a slow, agonizing disintegration of unity. What was once a singular, massive entity, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, began to fracture along the lines of personal ego and military might. The Diadochi did not merely fight for territory, they fought for the very definition of legitimacy. To rule the lands of the former Persians, one had to command the respect of the Greek soldiers and the administrative machinery Alexander had inherited. Perdiccas, the regent, attempted to hold the center, but his authority was a ghost. He was quickly swept aside by the rising tides of power. From the shadows emerged the Titans, Ptolemy, who seized the fertile Nile, Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, who sought to reunite the entire empire under his singular banner, and Seleucus, who would eventually plant his roots deep in the heart of the Iranian plateau. The wars were characterized by a terrifying scale of conflict. The battlefield was no longer a local affair. It was a continental struggle. Massive armies of Macedonian phalanxes, bristling with 18-foot sarissas, collided with waves of heavy cataphract cavalry and war elephants. Cities were besieged for years, and the wealth of the ancient Persian treasuries was bled dry to fund the endless campaigns of these warring kings. In the East, the impact on the Persian world was profound. As the Diadochi carved up the map, the once unified administrative structure of the Achaemenids was sliced into competing Hellenistic kingdoms. The Seleucid Empire emerged as the dominant force in the Iranian heartland, attempting to weave a new Greek identity into the ancient Persian tapestry. The Diadochi Wars were more than just a series of civil wars. They were the crucible in which the Hellenistic age was forged. The old Persian world was not being restored, nor was it being entirely erased. Instead, it was being forcibly synthesized. As the successors fought, they brought Greek language, philosophy, and art into the corridors of ancient palaces, creating a hybrid civilization. A world where Greek intellect and Persian administration began a long, turbulent dance. The era of the great kings was gone, replaced by an era of kings, who were themselves defined by the shadow of the man who had burned their world down. 301 BCE, Antioch on the Orontes. The dust of the Diadochi Wars had finally begun to settle, leaving behind a map redrawn by the sword. From the chaos of Alexander's death, a new order emerged. While the Ptolemies looked toward the Nile and the Antigonids toward Macedonia, Seleucus I Nicator carved out a realm that was, in many ways, the true spiritual successor to the Persian heartland. His empire was a colossus, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the very edges of the Indus, and at its core sat the ancient, rugged, and deeply storied lands of Iran. But the Seleucid era was not merely a period of political consolidation. It was a profound, often jarring collision of two incompatible worlds. On one side stood the Hellenic ideal, a culture defined by the logic of Aristotle, the drama of Sophocles, and the aesthetic precision of Greek sculpture. On the other stood the Persian tradition, a civilization built on the pillars of Zoroastrian faith, a rigid social hierarchy, and an administrative sophistication that had governed millions for centuries. The Seleucids did not seek to destroy the Persian identity, for they were too pragmatic to ignore the machinery of the empire they now ruled. Instead, they attempted a grand imperial experiment, Hellenization. They built cities, new gleaming metropolises like Seleucia on the Tigris, designed in the Greek fashion with agoras, theaters, and gymnasiums. They introduced the Greek language as the tongue of administration, commerce, and high culture. To the Seleucid kings, these cities were outposts of civilization, anchors of Greek thought in an alien landscape. Yet beneath the surface of this new Hellenistic veneer, the Persian soul remained unyielding. The satrapies, the ancient provinces, continued to function using the old Persian methods. The local nobility, the landed aristocracy who had served the Achaemenids, did not simply vanish. They adapted. They learned Greek, yes, but they did so while maintaining their ancestral customs, their religious rituals, and their deep connections to the land. This was a period of intense cultural friction. In the courts, one might see a Greek general dining on Persian delicacies, or a local magistrate interpreting a royal decree through the lens of ancient Iranian law. It was a world of syncretism, where the gods themselves began to blur. The Greek Apollo might find himself merged with the Persian Mithra. The Hellenic Artemis might be seen through the eyes of an Anahita worshipper. However, this synthesis was often a fragile mask. For the Greeks, the Persians were a people to be managed, a conquered subject class to be uplifted through the light of Hellenism. For the Persians, the Greeks were often seen as transient occupiers, storm-bringers who had arrived with Alexander and would eventually pass, leaving behind only the fragments of their presence. The Seleucid era was thus a tug-of-war between the old and the new. It was an era of magnificent, hybrid art and complex, dualistic politics. It was a time when the Mediterranean spirit attempted to graft itself onto the ancient roots of the East. While the Seleucids succeeded in creating a cosmopolitan world unlike any seen before, they could never fully erase the Persian ghost that haunted their palaces. The clash was not a single battle, but a slow, centuries-long negotiation between a culture of conquest and a culture of endurance. 200 BCE, the rugged highlands of Media. As the centuries progressed, the grand experiment of Seleucid Hellenism began to fray at the edges. The gleaming Greek cities, once intended to be beacons of Mediterranean culture, had become islands in a vast, unyielding Iranian sea. The political grip of the Seleucid kings was tightening in some areas, but in the peripheries, the mountains, the plateaus, and the remote satrapies, the Greek veneer was cracking. What emerged from these fissures was not merely a passive resentment, but a sophisticated, organized, and deeply rooted resurgence of Iranian identity. This was the era of the quiet resistance. It was not always a resistance of armies and open battlefields, though those occurred. More often, it was a resistance of the spirit, the hearth, and the temple. While the Greek elite spoke of philosophy and democracy, the Persian heartland was undergoing a profound cultural reassertion. The Zoroastrian priesthood, which had been sidelined during the initial Macedonian conquest, began to reclaim its central role in the social fabric. The sacred fires, once dimmed by the shadow of Alexander, were being tended once more, serving as the spiritual anchors for a people who refused to be assimilated. This cultural defiance found its most potent expression in the preservation of the Iranian social structure. The old nobility, the families who could trace their lineage back to the days of Cyrus and Darius, became the custodians of Persian tradition. They operated in the shadows of the Greek administration, maintaining their own networks of patronage, their own legal customs, and their own sense of honor. To the local population, the Greek language was the language of the tax collector and the governor, but Persian remained the language of the soul, the language of history, and the language of the land. But as the Seleucid authority weakened due to internal dynastic struggles and the rising pressure of Rome and Parthia in the east, this cultural simmering began to boil over into political action. The local Iranian identities were no longer content to merely exist alongside Hellenism. They sought to govern themselves once more. Small pockets of resistance coalesced into larger movements, fueled by a growing sense of Iraniyat, a burgeoning awareness of a shared Iranian destiny that transcended individual tribes or provinces. The most significant tremor in this shifting landscape came from the north and east. The Parni, a nomadic group of Iranian warriors, began to move into the heart of the empire. They were not just another wave of invaders. They were the embodiment of the very forces the Seleucids could never tame. As they moved through the satrapies, they tapped into the deep-seated desire for a native ruler, a king who did not look toward Athens or Macedonia for legitimacy, but one who understood the ancient rhythms of the Iranian plateau. The rise of these local identities signaled the beginning of the end for the Hellenistic dream in the East. The clash of civilizations was shifting from a struggle for territory to a struggle for the very definition of what the region would be. The Greeks had brought their theaters and their logic, but they had failed to plant them in soil that wasn't already saturated with the blood and the myths of Persia. The stage was being set for a new dynasty, one that would not just preserve the Persian identity, but would weaponize it to challenge the greatest powers of the ancient world. The ghost in the palace was finally stepping out into the light. 200 BCE, the rugged highlands of Media. The stage was set, but the actors were not the polished aristocrats of the Seleucid courts. They were the Parni. To the Greeks, they were little more than a shadow moving across the horizon, nomadic, restless, and unpredictable. But to the weary people of the Iranian plateau, they represented something much more potent, a return to the primal strength of the steppe. At the heart of this upheaval stood a man whose name would become synonymous with a new era of Persian sovereignty, Arsaces. Legend and history blur in the smoke of these early battles, but the essence of his rise is clear. Arsaces was not merely a warlord, he was a catalyst. Leading his kin through the treacherous mountain passes, he did not come as a conqueror seeking to destroy the existing order, but as a liberator seeking to reclaim it. The Parni were masters of a specific, lethal kind of warfare. They possessed a mobility that the heavy, slow-moving Macedonian phalanxes could never match. They lived in the saddle, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the horse and the pull of the bow. As they descended from the north, they began to strike at the fraying edges of Seleucid control, seizing satrapies and turning the very landscape against the Greek administrators. But the true genius of the Arsacid rise lay in their ability to do something no other nomadic group had successfully achieved. They learned to rule. Arsaces and his successors understood that while the horse won the battle, the throne required more than just steel. They realized that to hold the heart of Persia, they had to embrace its soul. As the Arsacids consolidated their power, they performed a masterful act of political alchemy. They did not attempt to erase the Hellenistic influence they encountered. Instead, they absorbed it, tempering it with the ancient traditions of the Iranian nobility. They took the administrative tools of the Greeks and the military prowess of the nomads, and they fused them into a new, uniquely Parthian identity. They began to patronize the Zoroastrian priesthood, signaling to the local populace that the era of foreign gods was drawing to a close. The transition from steppe warriors to imperial sovereigns was not instantaneous. It was a gradual, bloody, and calculated ascent. From their initial foothold in the northeast, the Arsacids pushed westward, systematically dismantling the Seleucid grip on Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. They transformed from a tribal confederation into a centralized empire, building cities and establishing trade routes that would soon link the Mediterranean to the Far East. By the time the dust of their initial conquests settled, the Arsacid dynasty had done more than just win a series of skirmishes. They had broken the cycle of Hellenistic dominance. They had proven that the Iranian spirit was not a relic of the past to be preserved in secret, but a living, breathing force capable of building a superpower. The Parthians had arrived, not as ghosts in the palace, but as the new masters of the East, ready to stand eye to eye with the rising might of Rome and redefine the destiny of the Silk Road. 150 BCE, the vast, windswept plains of the Khorasan frontier. To understand how the Parthians transformed from a band of migrating tribes into the nightmare of the Roman legions, one must look beyond the politics of the court and into the very marrow of their martial identity. The Arsacid strength did not lie in stone walls or massive infantry blocks, but in a symbiotic relationship between man and horse, a lethal synergy perfected on the endless stretches of the Eurasian steppe. The foundation of this military supremacy was the horse archer. For the Parthian warrior, the bow was not merely a weapon, it was an extension of his own anatomy. Trained from childhood, these riders possessed a terrifying level of coordination. They could gallop at full tilt, leaning precariously from their saddles to loose a feathered shaft with surgical precision. They mastered the art of the Parthian shot, a maneuver of psychological and tactical brilliance. As they feigned a retreat, drawing an overconfident enemy into a disorganized pursuit, the riders would suddenly wheel their horses in mid-gallop, turning backward to rain a storm of arrows upon the fleeing pursuers. It was a tactic that turned an enemy's own momentum against them, turning a charge into a massacre. But the Parthian military machine was not a one-dimensional force of skirmishers. As the empire matured, the nomads realized that to face the heavy infantry of the West, they needed more than just agility, they needed impact. This led to the evolution of their most feared asset, the cataphract. If the horse archer was the sting of the Parthian wasp, the cataphract was its crushing weight. These were the precursors to the medieval knight, but far more formidable in their scale. Both rider and mount were encased in a shimmering, interlocking shell of scale armor, often made of bronze or iron. These heavy cavalrymen did not merely skirmish, they delivered the decisive, bone-breaking blow. Emerging from a cloud of dust, a line of cataphracts would strike like a tidal wave, their long lances, the contos, capable of impaling multiple men at once. This dual-threat capability, the ability to harass with relentless, mobile archery and then shatter the enemy with heavy, armored shock cavalry, created a tactical paradox that the Mediterranean powers struggled to solve. The Greeks had relied on the rigid discipline of the phalanx, and the Romans on the grit of the legion. But how do you fight an enemy that can shoot you from a distance where you cannot reach them, and then, when you are exhausted and disorganized, charge you with a wall of steel? The Parthian battlefield was a masterclass in fluidity. They utilized the steppe's greatest gift, space. By drawing their opponents into the vast, open expanses of the Iranian plateau, they negated the advantages of heavy infantry. They turned the very geography of the East into a weapon. This mastery of movement and metal did more than just win battles. It dictated the terms of global power. It ensured that the Silk Road remained under the watchful eye of the Arsacid kings, as any caravan or army that dared traverse these lands had to contend with the undisputed masters of the saddle. The Parthians had not just reclaimed a kingdom, they had weaponized the horizon itself. 100 BCE. The bustling, sun-drenched caravanserais of Ctesiphon and Ecbatana. If the Parthian military was the steel spine of the empire, then commerce was its lifeblood. While the Roman legions obsessed over the borders of the Mediterranean, the Arsacids were looking toward a much grander, more lucrative horizon. They had positioned themselves at the precise fulcrum of the world. To the east lay the mysterious, silk-producing giants of the Han dynasty. To the west, the insatiable markets of Rome and the Mediterranean. And stretching between them, a labyrinthine network of desert tracks, mountain passes, and river valleys known as the Silk Road. The Parthians did not merely inhabit this road, they owned the gates. They became the indispensable middlemen of the ancient world. Imagine, if you will, a caravan stretching for miles across the Iranian plateau. It is a moving city of camels and mules, laden with the treasures of a dozen civilizations. From the east comes the shimmering, lightweight luxury of Chinese silk, alongside fine lacquers, exotic spices, and delicate jade. From the deep jungles of the south come fragrant frankincense and myrrh. From the far west, the Romans send glassware, gold, and fine textiles. In the hands of the Parthian middlemen, these goods were more than just commodities. They were instruments of geopolitical leverage. The Arsacids understood a fundamental truth of empire. He who controls the flow of wealth controls the destiny of nations. They did not need to conquer the world to rule it. They simply had to tax the movement of its desires. By establishing fortified way stations, protecting trade routes from bandits, and providing organized security, the Parthians transformed the chaotic movement of goods into a highly profitable, state-sanctioned machine. The wealth generated by these tolls and duties was staggering. It flowed into the coffers of the Arsacid kings, allowing them to fund the very cavalry that protected the routes in the first place, a self-sustaining cycle of martial strength and commercial prosperity. This wealth did more than just build palaces, it fueled a cultural explosion. As merchants exchanged silk for silver, they also exchanged ideas, philosophies, and technologies. In the marketplaces of the Parthian Levant and the hubs of Mesopotamia, one could hear a dozen languages spoken in a single afternoon. Greek art mingled with Persian motifs. Buddhist thought drifted along the steppe routes to meet Zoroastrian traditions, and the mathematical innovations of the East began their slow crawl toward the West. The Parthian Empire became a giant, living sponge, soaking up the intellectual and aesthetic essence of the entire known world. This was the Silk Road nexus. It was a period where Persia acted as the world's great translator, turning the isolation of distant empires into a global conversation. The Parthians had mastered the art of the pivot, balancing the might of Rome against the mystery of China, ensuring that whether a merchant sought profit or a king sought power, they had to pass through the hands of the Arsacids. Through trade, the Parthians had woven themselves into the very fabric of global history, creating a web of dependency that made their empire not just a regional power, but the indispensable heart of the ancient world. 53 BCE. The blood-soaked plains of Kari near the banks of the Euphrates. For centuries, the Silk Road had brought the Parthians unimaginable wealth, but wealth on this scale inevitably attracts predators. As the Arsacid coffers swelled, the gaze of the Mediterranean turned eastward. To the Romans, the Parthians were not merely merchants. They were a formidable, enigmatic barrier standing between the Roman eagle and the riches of the Orient. What began as border skirmishes soon escalated into an eternal, grinding struggle, a geopolitical chess match played out across the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia and the rugged, unforgiving highlands of Armenia. The conflict was defined by a fundamental clash of military philosophies. On one side stood the Roman legion, a heavy, disciplined, and unstoppable machine of infantry. The Roman soldier was a master of the siege, the fortification, and the tight-knit formation. They sought to conquer territory, to build roads, and to impose a permanent, structured order upon the landscape. Opposing them were the masters of the steppe, the Parthian horse archers and their devastating heavy cavalry, the cataphracts. The Parthian way of war was one of fluid motion and psychological terror. They did not seek to hold a line, they sought to break it. They perfected the Parthian shot, a maneuver of such lethal grace that a rider could appear to be retreating in flight, only to twist in the saddle and loose a deadly volley of arrows into the pursuing Roman ranks. At Carrhae, this tactical brilliance turned the Roman dream of Eastern conquest into a nightmare of dust and death, proving that the legions were not invincible against the fury of the steppe. Yet the wars were about more than just military doctrine. They were about the control of the buffer states. At the heart of this struggle lay Armenia. Perched atop the Armenian highlands, Armenia was the strategic pivot of the ancient Near East. To hold Armenia was to hold the high ground. To control it was to possess a dagger pointed directly at the heart of either empire. For generations, the Romans and Parthians engaged in a wearying cycle of installing puppet kings, launching invasions to depose them, and fighting brutal wars to reinstate their own chosen heirs. Mesopotamia served as the secondary, equally violent theater. The Fertile Crescent, home to the great cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, was the prize of every campaign. It was the gateway to the Silk Road, the fertile granary of the East, and the ultimate symbol of imperial prestige. To capture Ctesiphon was to strike a blow at the very soul of Parthian power. To defend it was to ensure the survival of the Arsacid dynasty. This was not a war of rapid conquest or decisive, final victories. It was a war of attrition, a pendulum that swung back and forth for centuries. When Rome surged forward, the Parthians retreated into the desert, drawing the legions deep into hostile territory until they withered from thirst and exhaustion. When the Parthians attempted to push westward, the Roman fortifications and disciplined steel would halt their advance. In this eternal struggle, neither empire could truly annihilate the other. Instead, they became two sides of the same coin, two superpowers locked in a perpetual embrace of violence and necessity, forever defining the boundaries of the civilized world through the smoke of battle and the clash of iron. 1st century CE. The bustling marketplaces of Seleucia on the Tigris. While the thunder of Roman legions and Parthian cavalry echoed across the frontiers, a far more subtle, yet equally profound, transformation was taking place deep within the heart of the empire. If the wars with Rome were the external shell of the Parthian era, then cultural syncretism was its living, breathing soul. This was not a world of isolated monoliths, but a grand, swirling crucible where three distinct worlds, the sophisticated Hellenism of the Mediterranean, the ancient grandeur of Persia, and the raw, nomadic energy of the steppe, collided and fused into something entirely new. To understand this, one must look at the cities. For centuries, the successors of Alexander the Great had carved out Greek-style polis across the Iranian plateau. But the Parthians, rather than erasing this Greek heritage, chose to absorb it. In the great urban centers, the social fabric was a mosaic. You might find a merchant in Seleucia, dressed in a Greek chiton, conducting business in Koine Greek, yet offering a sacrifice to an Iranian deity under the watchful eye of a local magistrate. The Greek language became the lingua franca of administration and high culture, yet it carried the weight of Persian concepts of kingship and cosmic order. This blending was most visible in the arts. The rigid, formal aesthetics of the old Achaemenid era were giving way to a more fluid, expressive style. In the coinage of the Arsacid kings, we see a striking visual dialogue. The portraits of the monarchs often bore the unmistakable features of the Iranian warrior kings, yet they were framed by the elegant, classical motifs of the Hellenistic world. Art became a language of hybridity, where the realism of Greek sculpture met the intricate, symbolic patterns of the East. But the third ingredient in this alchemy was the steppe. The Parthians themselves were descendants of the Parni, a nomadic tribe from the northern plains. They brought with them a culture of mobility, a reverence for the horse, and a social structure rooted in tribal loyalty. This nomadic spirit infused the settled Persian cities with a new vitality. The Parthian court was not just a place of sedentary bureaucracy. It was a mobile center of power, where the luxury of silk and fine wine met the rugged traditions of the horsemen. The very architecture of the era began to reflect this, blending the massive, stone-built traditions of the Near East with the lighter, more adaptable structures of the nomadic peoples. Even religion began to reflect this convergence. While Zoroastrianism remained the spiritual bedrock of the Iranian identity, the boundaries of faith were porous. The gods of the Greeks, such as Apollo or Artemis, were often identified with Iranian deities like Mithra or Anahita. This was not a loss of identity, but an expansion of it. It was a practical, cosmopolitan response to a world that was more connected than ever before. As the Silk Road pumped the wealth of China and India through the Parthian veins, the empire became the ultimate crossroads of antiquity. The Parthians were the great mediators, not just of goods, but of ideas. In the shadow of the Arsacid throne, the distinctions between conqueror and conquered, Greek and Persian, nomad and settler, began to blur. They were creating a unique, hybridized civilization, a bridge between worlds that would set the stage for the even more spectacular resurgence of the Persian spirit in the centuries to come. 1st century CE, the sprawling, sun-drenched avenues of Ctesiphon. If the cultural melting pot of the previous era provided the soul of the empire, it was the sheer, staggering wealth of the Arsacid zenith that provided its muscle. We have spoken of the blending of cultures, but to truly grasp the height of Parthian power, one must look past the philosophy and the art, and look instead at the gold. By the turn of the 1st century, the Parthian Empire had transitioned from a collection of loosely affiliated steppe tribes into a sophisticated, urbanized superpower, a state that did not just survive the Silk Road, but mastered it. This was the era of the great middlemen. As the Roman Empire expanded eastward and the Han dynasty pushed westward, the Parthians sat squarely in the center, acting as the indispensable gatekeepers of global commerce. They were the masters of the transit, the tax collectors of the world's most lucrative trade routes. Every bale of Chinese silk, every ounce of Indian spice, and every precious gemstone that moved between the Mediterranean and the Far East had to pass through the hands of the Arsacid nobility. This was not merely trade. It was a massive, continuous infusion of capital that fueled an unprecedented urban explosion. The landscape of the empire began to change. The rugged, nomadic camps of the early Arsacids were being replaced by monumental urbanism. Cities were no longer just defensive outposts or Greek colonial remnants. They became sprawling, wealthy metropolises. Ctesiphon, rising on the banks of the Tigris, began its ascent to become one of the greatest cities in the world, a glittering capital of palaces, gardens, and vast marketplaces that rivaled even the majesty of Rome. Here, the wealth of the Silk Road was etched into the very stone of the city. We see the rise of grand irrigation systems that turned the arid plains into lush, productive agricultural hubs, supporting growing populations and fueling the lifestyles of an increasingly complex aristocracy. This prosperity gave rise to a new kind of Parthian nobility. No longer just horse lords and warriors, they were now sophisticated patrons of culture and architects of empire. They lived in villas that blended the comforts of the Mediterranean with the grandeur of the East, surrounded by exotic flora and fauna brought from the furthest reaches of the known world. The Arsacid kings, in turn, used this wealth to project an image of absolute, unquestionable majesty. Their courts were no longer mere tribal assemblies, but choreographed displays of imperial splendor, where the king sat as a semi-divine figure, surrounded by the immense gravity of a global economic engine. Yet this zenith was not built on commerce alone. The prosperity of the cities and the wealth of the Silk Road provided the resources necessary to sustain the Parthian war machine. The heavy cataphract cavalry, those ironclad titans of the battlefield, were not just soldiers. They were the high-status symbols of an elite class enriched by trade. The economic boom and military prowess became a self-sustaining cycle. Wealth funded the cavalry, and the cavalry protected the trade routes that generated the wealth. At this moment in history, the Parthian Empire stood as a titan of the ancient world. It was a civilization that had achieved the impossible. It had taken the chaotic energy of the steppe and harnessed it into a structured, urbanized, and immensely wealthy imperial machine. They had created a world where the wealth of the East flowed through the veins of a Persian heart, setting the stage for a period of dominance that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the Near East. 224 CE. The dusty, sun-scorched plains of Fars, Persia. But even the most glittering empire can succumb to the rot of its own success. As the centuries progressed, the very wealth that had fueled the Parthian zenith began to fracture the foundations of the Arsacid state. The central authority of the kings grew increasingly fragile, diluted by a powerful, fractious nobility that functioned more like independent warlords than loyal subjects. The once unified vision of the Silk Road gatekeepers was dissolving into a patchwork of competing interests, local feuds, and administrative decay. The ironclad discipline of the Parthian cavalry was being replaced by the complacency of an aristocracy more interested in their private villas than the defense of the realm. Into this vacuum of power stepped a man who would not merely seek to lead the empire, but to reinvent it entirely. His name was Ardashir. Ardashir was not a product of the Parthian court, but a man fueled by a much older, much deeper fire. He was a descendant of the house of Sassan, a family that claimed lineage not from the nomadic steppe lords of the Arsacids, but from the legendary kings of the Achaemenid era. To Ardashir, the Parthians were not the rightful heirs to the Persian soul. They were an interloping force, a Hellenized, nomadic veneer that had covered the true essence of Iran for too long. He did not just want to conquer territory. He wanted to restore a lost glory. He sought to resurrect the ghost of Cyrus and Darius, to strip away the layers of Greek and nomadic influence, and to return Persia to its primordial, sacred roots. The campaign of Ardashir was a lightning strike through the heart of a decaying system. Starting from his power base in the province of Pars, he began a systematic dismantling of Arsacid authority. He moved with a ferocity that caught the aging Parthian monarchs off guard, turning local grievances into a revolutionary tide. His rise was not merely a political coup, it was a crusade. He framed his struggle as a cosmic necessity, a movement to return the empire to the light of Zoroastrianism and the purity of the ancient Iranian traditions. The climax of this struggle came at the Battle of Hormozgan. It was a collision of two worlds, the fading, cosmopolitan splendor of the Parthian Old Guard against the disciplined, ideologically driven fervor of Ardashir's rising forces. The battle was brutal, a chaotic clash of heavy cavalry and ancient blood feuds. When the dust finally settled upon the battlefield, the Arsacid dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 5 centuries, was broken. The era of the nomadic kings was over. From the ashes of the Parthian collapse, Ardashir I emerged not just as a conqueror, but as the founder of the Sassanid Empire. This was more than a change of dynasty. It was a total revolution of the Persian state. Ardashir began the monumental task of centralizing power, transforming a loose confederation of nobles into a highly structured, bureaucratic machine. He institutionalized the faith, weaving Zoroastrianism into the very fabric of the government, creating a state where the king was the defender of the divine truth. The rebirth had begun. The shadow of the steppe was gone, and in its place rose a rejuvenated, fierce, and deeply spiritual empire, one that would spend the next 4 centuries challenging the greatest powers of the ancient world. 224 CE, the dusty, sun-scorched plains of Faras, Persia. But even the most glittering empire can succumb to the rot of its own success. As the centuries progressed, the very wealth that had fueled the Parthian zenith began to fracture the foundations of the Arsacid state. The central authority of the kings grew increasingly fragile, diluted by a powerful, fractious nobility that functioned more like independent warlords than loyal subjects. The once unified vision of the Silk Road gatekeepers was dissolving into a patchwork of competing interests, local feudals, and administrative decay. The ironclad discipline of the Parthian cavalry was being replaced by the complacency of an aristocracy more interested in their private villas than the defense of the realm. Into this vacuum of power stepped a man who would not merely seek to lead the empire, but to reinvent it entirely. His name was Ardashir. Ardashir was not a product of the Parthian court, but a man fueled by a much older, much deeper fire. He was a descendant of the House of Sassan, a family that claimed lineage not from the nomadic steppe lords of the Arsacids, but from the legendary kings of the Achaemenid era. To Ardashir, the Parthians were not the rightful heirs to the Persian soul. They were an interloping force, a Hellenized, nomadic veneer that had covered the true essence of Iran for too long. He did not just want to conquer territory. He wanted to restore a lost glory. He sought to resurrect the ghost of Cyrus and Darius, to strip away the layers of Greek and nomadic influence, and to return Persia to its primordial, sacred roots. The campaign of Ardashir was a lightning strike through the heart of a decaying system. Starting from his power base in the province of Pars, he began a systematic dismantling of Arsacid authority. He moved with a ferocity that caught the aging Parthian monarchs off guard, turning local grievances into a revolutionary tide. His rise was not merely a political coup, it was a crusade. He framed his struggle as a cosmic necessity, a movement to return the empire to the light of Zoroastrianism and the purity of the ancient Iranian traditions. The climax of this struggle came at the Battle of Hormozgan. It was a collision of two worlds, the fading, cosmopolitan splendor of the Parthian Old Guard against the disciplined, ideologically driven fervor of Ardashir's rising forces. The battle was brutal, a chaotic clash of heavy cavalry and ancient blood feuds. When the dust finally settled upon the battlefield, the Arsacid dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 5 centuries, was broken. The era of the nomadic kings was over. From the ashes of the Parthian collapse, Ardashir I emerged not just as a conqueror, but as the founder of the Sassanid Empire. This was more than a change of dynasty. It was a total revolution of the Persian state. Ardashir began the monumental task of centralizing power, transforming a loose confederation of nobles into a highly structured, bureaucratic machine. He institutionalized the faith, weaving Zoroastrianism into the very fabric of the government, creating a state where the king was the defender of the divine truth. The rebirth had begun. The shadow of the steppe was gone, and in its place rose a rejuvenated, fierce, and deeply spiritual empire, one that would spend the next 4 centuries challenging the greatest powers of the ancient world. 240 CE, the iron-willed heart of the Sasanian Empire. If Ardashir was the architect of the Sasanian rebirth, his son, Shapur I, was its hammer. Where the father had focused on the internal consolidation of the Persian soul, the son turned his gaze outward, toward the setting sun and the formidable shadow of Rome. The Sasanian resurgence was no longer a mere regional rebellion. It had become a global superpower, and its primary rival stood waiting in the west, the Roman Empire. For decades, the borderlands of Mesopotamia and Armenia had been a theater of endless, grinding conflict. But Shapur was not interested in mere border skirmishes. He sought a definitive confrontation that would signal to the world that the era of Roman hegemony in the East was over. He sought to prove that the Sasanian flame burned brighter than the Roman eagle. That moment of reckoning arrived in the mid-3rd century. The Roman Empire, once an unbreakable monolith, was beginning to fracture under the weight of internal instability and the crisis of the 3rd century. Sensing this vulnerability, Shapur launched a series of lightning campaigns that would defy the imagination of the ancient world. The first great shockwave came at the Battle of Edessa. The Roman Emperor Gordian III, leading a massive expeditionary force to reclaim lost territories, found himself trapped in the suffocating heat of the Mesopotamian plains. Shapur's heavy cavalry, the legendary Savarin, struck with the precision of a surgical blade. The Roman legions, trained for different terrains and different enemies, were overwhelmed by the sheer mobility and devastating impact of the Persian armored horsemen. In the chaos of the retreat, the Roman army was shattered, and the emperor himself was killed. It was a humiliation that sent tremors through the streets of Rome. But Shapur's greatest triumph was yet to come. Years later, the Roman Emperor Valerian, seeking to restore Roman prestige, marched his legions into the heart of the Sasanian sphere. He expected a traditional campaign of attrition. Instead, he walked into a trap of epic proportions. At the Battle of Edessa, once again, the Sasanian tactical genius outmatched Roman rigidity. The Roman lines broke, the legions dissolved into a panicked mass, and Valerian himself was captured alive. The image of this moment became the ultimate propaganda tool for the Sasanian dynasty. To the Persians, it was divine vindication. To the Romans, it was a nightmare made flesh. For centuries, the concept of a Roman emperor being taken prisoner was unthinkable, a violation of the natural order. Now, the conqueror of emperors sat upon the throne of Ctesiphon, a living testament to Persian supremacy. Shapur did not merely defeat Rome, he psychologically dismantled it. He utilized these victories to cement his legitimacy, carving his triumphs into the very cliffs of Nakshi-Rostam. There, in massive rock reliefs, he immortalized the scene. The Roman emperor, humbled and bowed before the towering, divinely sanctioned figure of the King of Kings. Through these victories, Shapur I had achieved what his father had only dreamed of. He had taken the reconstructed Persian identity and projected it onto the world stage. The Sasanian Empire was no longer just a successor to the Achaemenids. It was a peer, a rival, and a conqueror of the greatest empire the West had ever known. The era of Sasanian dominance had truly arrived. 531 CE, the gilded halls of Ctesiphon. If Shapur I was the hammer that broke the Roman spirit, then his descendant, Khusro I, would be the architect who built a monument of order upon the ruins of chaos. He did not merely inherit an empire. He inherited a machine that was beginning to grind itself to pieces under the weight of corruption, inefficient taxation, and the endless, draining wars with Byzantium. To the world he was the King of Kings, but to his people he would earn a title that echoed through the centuries, Anushirvan, the immortal soul, the just king. Khusro understood a truth that many conquerors forget. An empire is not sustained by the edge of a sword alone, but by the stability of its foundation. He realized that if the central government could not feed its people or protect its borders without bleeding the peasantry dry, the empire would collapse from within long before an enemy ever reached its gates. His first great crusade was not against a foreign foe, but against the very structure of the Persian state. He launched a radical administrative revolution. He dismantled the old, bloated system of provincial governors who had acted like petty kings, replacing them with a streamlined bureaucracy loyal only to the throne. He implemented a revolutionary land tax, a system so precise and calculated that it moved Persia away from the unpredictable whims of seasonal harvests toward a stable, predictable revenue stream. This allowed for the creation of a professional, standing army, no longer dependent on fickle feudal levies, but composed of soldiers whose sole loyalty was to the Sasanians. But Khusro's justice was not merely bureaucratic, it was philosophical. He transformed the empire into a beacon of the intellect. Under his reign, the court at Ctesiphon became the beating heart of the ancient world's knowledge. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, famously inviting scholars, physicians, and philosophers from Greece, India, and Syria to settle in Persia. He understood that to rule the world, one must also master its wisdom. It was during this era that the Academy of Gandhishapur rose to prominence, becoming the greatest center of learning in the world, a bridge between the fading wisdom of antiquity and the coming dawn of the Islamic Golden Age. Yet for all his brilliance in peace, Khusro was a titan in war. He did not allow the empire to grow soft in its prosperity. He engaged in a titanic, decades-long struggle with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, proving that the Sasanians could match the Romans not just in tactical brilliance, but in sheer endurance and strategic depth. He fought to secure the frontiers, to control the Silk Road, and to ensure that the Persian lion remained the undisputed master of the East. Khusro I Anushirvan represented the absolute zenith of the Sasanians. He was the synthesis of the warrior and the sage, the conqueror and the lawmaker. He took the raw, martial energy of his ancestors and refined it into a sophisticated, enduring civilization. Under his hand, Persia was no longer just a superpower. It was a standard of civilization against which all other nations were measured. He had achieved the impossible. He had created a state that was as much a work of art as it was a machine of war. 602 CE. The burning frontiers of Mesopotamia. If Khusro I was the architect who built the Persian machine to its absolute perfection, then the era that followed would be the era of its slow, agonizing disintegration. The immortal soul had left behind an empire at its zenith, but he had also left behind a geopolitical reality that was fundamentally unsustainable. For centuries, the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire had functioned like two colossal lungs, breathing in unison, expanding and contracting, fighting over the same fertile crescents and the same vital trade routes. They were the two eyes of the ancient world, one looking toward the Silk Road and the mysteries of the East, the other toward the Mediterranean and the legacy of Rome. But these eyes were beginning to fail. The final, titanic struggle between these two superpowers would not be a war of quick conquests or glorious triumphs, but a war of attrition, a war of the two eyes that would eventually leave both sides blind. This was the Great War of 602 to 628 CE, a conflict that would dwarf all the skirmishes of the previous centuries. It began with a vacuum of power, a spark ignited by the chaos of Byzantine succession and the predatory ambitions of the Sasanian Shah, Khosrow II. Driven by a desire to reclaim the lost glory of the Achaemenids, the Persian armies did what no one had managed to do in centuries. They broke the Roman spirit. Under the brilliant leadership of generals like Shahrbaraz, the Sasanian forces swept through Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. They breached the walls of Antioch, they seized the holy cities of the Levant, and they stood at the very gates of Constantinople. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, it appeared that the sun was finally setting on the Roman world, and that the Sasanian banner would fly over the entirety of the Near East. But the Roman spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. Under the leadership of the Emperor Heraclius, the Byzantines underwent a desperate, miraculous transformation. Heraclius did not just defend. He struck back with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. He bypassed the Persian armies, struck deep into the heart of the Sasanian Empire, and brought the war to the very doorstep of Ctesiphon. The conflict descended into a nightmare of endless sieges, scorched earth, and depleted treasuries. Both empires were forced to strip their provinces bare to fund their machines of war. The peasantry, once the backbone of Khusro's reforms, were now crushed under the weight of unprecedented taxation to pay for a war that seemed to have no end. The professional armies, the pride of both thrones, were being bled dry in the deserts and mountains of Armenia and Mesopotamia. By the time the dust finally settled in 628, there were no victors, only survivors. The Sasanian Empire, once a monolith of stability, was fractured by civil war and political assassinations. The Byzantine Empire, though it had reclaimed its lost territories, was a hollow shell of its former self. The two eyes of the world had fought until they were sightless, exhausted by their own brilliance and their mutual hatred. They had spent their strength fighting one another, leaving the gates of the ancient world wide open for a new, even more formidable power to emerge from the sands of the south. 602 CE, the burning frontiers of Mesopotamia. Yet, to understand the magnitude of what was being lost in those final, exhausted years, we must step back from the blood-soaked battlefields and look instead toward the heart of the empire. We must look toward the riverbanks of the Tigris, to the city that served as the beating pulse of the Sassanid world. Ctesiphon. If the frontiers were the shield of the empire, Ctesiphon was its soul. It was not merely a capital. It was a statement of cosmic order made manifest in brick, mortar, and gold. To enter Ctesiphon was to witness the absolute zenith of Persian sophistication. It was a city where the rugged strength of the Iranian plateau met the refined elegance of the Mesopotamian plains, creating a metropolitan marvel that rivaled, and often eclipsed, the grandeur of Rome or Constantinople. At the center of this world stood the Tak Kasra, the great arch of Ctesiphon. Even today, its colossal silhouette haunts the landscape as a ghost of a lost era. This was the largest single-span brick arch in the world, a feat of engineering that defied the gravity of its time. It was a doorway to the divine, designed to make even the most powerful foreign ambassadors feel small in the presence of the King of Kings. When the Shah sat beneath that vault, he was not merely a man. He was the pivot upon which the universe turned. But the splendor of Ctesiphon was not found only in its scale, but in its nuance. The court was a theater of meticulous ritual and unparalleled luxury. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive incense and the rustle of heavy silk brocades. The Sassanid elite lived in a world of sensory perfection, where silver vessels were chased with scenes of mythic hunts, and carpets were woven with such complexity they seemed to hold the very patterns of the heavens. Yet the true greatness of the Sassanid court lay in its intellect. Ctesiphon was a crucible of ideas, a grand library of the ancient world. Under the patronage of kings like Khusro I, the empire became a sanctuary for the thinkers of the age. It was here that the wisdom of Greece was preserved, translated, and synthesized with the profound traditions of India and Persia. The Academy of Gundishapur, though a short distance away, functioned as the intellectual engine of the capital, drawing physicians, astronomers and philosophers from across the known world. In the halls of the Sassanid court, the logic of Aristotle met the mathematics of India and the mysticism of Zoroastrianism. This was an empire that understood that power is not merely maintained through the sword, but through the mind. The administration was a marvel of bureaucracy, a sophisticated machine of tax collectors, scholars, and diplomats that allowed the Shah to project his will across thousands of miles. Ctesiphon was the jewel of the Orient, a shining beacon of a civilization that had reached the absolute summit of human achievement. It was a place where art, science, and absolute monarchy converged to create a golden age of unparalleled brilliance. But as we have seen, even the most magnificent monuments cannot withstand the erosion of total war. The very splendor that made Ctesiphon the envy of the world would soon become its greatest vulnerability, as the exhausted empire struggled to protect its glittering heart from the gathering storm. 628 CE, the hallowed halls of Ctesiphon. The splendor we have witnessed, the towering arches, the silk-clad courts, and the intellectual brilliance of the academy, had become a gilded mask, concealing a face of profound exhaustion. For decades, the Sassanid Empire had been locked in a titanic, existential struggle with the Byzantine Empire. This was not merely a series of border skirmishes. It was a war of attrition that had drained the very lifeblood of the Iranian plateau. The War of the Two Eyes had become a cycle of endless mobilization, a grinding machine of conquest and counter-conquest that left both empires hollowed out, their treasuries empty, and their populations depleted. As the great kings fought for dominance over Mesopotamia and the Levant, the internal foundations of the empire began to crumble. The immense cost of maintaining such a massive military machine required a crushing tax burden. The peasantry, once the backbone of the imperial economy, found themselves squeezed between the demands of the royal tax collectors and the constant threat of famine and plague. The sophisticated bureaucracy that once ensured stability now became a mechanism of extraction, breeding resentment in the provinces and deepening the divide between the elite in Ctesiphon and the commoners in the hinterlands. This economic decay was compounded by a catastrophic breakdown in political legitimacy. The Sassanid line, which had provided a sense of cosmic continuity for centuries, was suddenly fractured by a succession of short-lived, weak, and often illegitimate rulers. The central authority of the King of Kings was being eroded by the very nobility meant to uphold it. Powerful aristocratic families, once the pillars of the state, began to act as independent warlords, carving out their own spheres of influence and treating the throne as a prize to be manipulated rather than a sacred office to be served. The religious fabric of the empire, too, began to fray. While Zoroastrianism remained the state faith, its institutionalization under the Sassanids had created a powerful and sometimes rigid clergy. As the empire stumbled, the spiritual certainty that had unified the people began to waver. In the shadows of the great fires, new ideas were taking root. Minority groups, feeling marginalized by the state church, and disillusioned citizens looking for a different sense of cosmic order, began to look elsewhere. The religious unity that had once served as the empire's spiritual shield was transforming into a source of internal friction. By the mid-7th century, the Sassanid Empire was a giant with feet of clay. It possessed the outward trappings of a superpower, the magnificent cities, the legendary cavalry, the vast administrative networks, but its internal organs were failing. The resources were spent, the people were weary, the leadership was divided. The empire was no longer a cohesive organism capable of responding to a sudden, external shock. It had become a collection of fractured interests, held together by nothing more than the memory of past glory. The stage was set. The great walls of the empire were still standing, but the strength required to man them had vanished. As the desert winds shifted, bringing with them a new force from the south and east, the Sassanids would find that they were not fighting a war of conquest, but rather a struggle to survive the consequences of their own exhaustion. The storm was no longer gathering, it had arrived. 633 CE. The arid fringes of the Mesopotamian desert, where the exhausted Sassanid legions expected a mere tribal incursion, they instead encountered a whirlwind. From the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, a new force was surging northward, not driven by the traditional ambitions of kings, but by a singular, transcendent fervor. The rise of Islam had fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of the Near East. These were the Rashidun Caliphate's armies, unified by a new monotheistic vision and a tactical mobility that the heavy, encumbered Persian cavalry could scarcely match. The collision was inevitable and devastating. The Sassanid military, designed for the grand, set-piece battles of imperial warfare, found itself ill-equipped to deal with the lightning-fast maneuvers of the Arab light cavalry. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the fate of an empire hung in the balance. It was a clash of two worlds, the ancient, structured majesty of the Persian tradition against the raw, disciplined energy of the Islamic expansion. The defeat of the Persian forces at Qadisiyah was more than a tactical loss. It was a psychological catastrophe. The King of Kings was no longer seen as the invincible protector of the cosmic order. The myth of Sassanid permanence had been shattered. The collapse was not a slow decline, but a cascading failure. As the Arab armies pushed deeper into the Iranian heartland, the fractured nobility, the very warlords we saw emerging in the previous decade, found themselves unable to mount a unified defense. Some chose to fight to the last man. Others, seeing the writing on the wall, negotiated terms of surrender to preserve their local influence. By 651 CE, with the death of the last Sassanid monarch, Yazdijerd III, the imperial era of Persia officially drew to a close. The throne of the Achaemenids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids had fallen. Yet to view this period solely as a story of destruction would be to miss the profound complexity of what followed. The Arab conquest was a political and military revolution, but it was not an immediate cultural erasure. The transition from the Sassanid to the Islamic era was not a sudden disappearance of Persia, but a metamorphosis. As the new administration settled into the conquered territories, they discovered a startling reality. The sophisticated Persian bureaucracy was far more advanced than anything the early caliphate possessed. To govern their vast new territories, the Arab conquerors found they could not discard the Persian system. They had to adopt it. The Persian administrators, the tax collectors, and the scholars became the indispensable architects of the new Islamic state. While the political superstructure changed, the soul of the nation began a process of incredible resilience. The Persian language, though superseded by Arabic in religious and official contexts, did not die. Instead, it began to weave itself into the fabric of the new era, eventually undergoing a renaissance that would produce some of the greatest poetry and science the world had ever known. The religion of the empire changed. but the intellectual and aesthetic DNA of the people remained stubbornly, beautifully Persian. The empire had fallen, but the civilization was merely changing its skin. The era of the caliphate had begun, but within its heart, the ancient spirit of Persia was already preparing to shape the very world that had conquered it. 750 CE. The bustling marketplaces of Baghdad and the scholarly halls of Khorasan. The dust of the great conquests had finally begun to settle, but what emerged from the wreckage was not a graveyard of a dead civilization, but a vibrant, hybridized world. The political map had been redrawn, and the temples of the old gods were falling silent, yet the ghost of Persia was everywhere. It was a quiet, intellectual conquest, one where the conquered became the masters of the conqueror's mind. This phenomenon is often called the Persianate transformation. While the Arabic language became the sacred vehicle for the Quran and the legal language of the Caliphate, it could not claim dominion over the human heart or the complexities of high administration. The early Islamic rulers, realizing that an empire cannot be governed by zeal alone, turned to the very people they had defeated to build their new world. The Persian divan, the sophisticated system of bureaucracy, taxation, and record-keeping, became the backbone of the Abbasid Caliphate. The conquerors provided the faith, but the Persians provided the structure. This administrative integration paved the way for a profound cultural osmosis. In the courts of the new caliphs, the etiquette, the courtly manners, and the very concept of kingship were heavily modeled after the Sassanid tradition. The king of kings may have been gone, but the idea of the just ruler and the majesty of the imperial court survived, translated into a new Islamic context. Nowhere was this survival more miraculous than in the realm of language and literature. For a time, Persian was relegated to the domestic sphere, a language of the home and the hearth. But it did not wither. Instead, it underwent a metamorphosis. As the centuries progressed, the Persian language began to absorb Arabic script and vocabulary, creating a new, rhythmic, and incredibly flexible medium. This was the birth of New Persian. It became the language of the soul. Through the medium of poetry, the Persian identity achieved a form of immortality that no army could touch. When the great poets like Ferdowsi began to write, they were not merely composing verses. They were engaging in an act of cultural preservation. In his epic, the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi sought to rescue the history, the heroes, and the linguistic essence of ancient Iran from the brink of oblivion. He used the new Persian tongue to tell the old stories, ensuring that even as the people embraced a new faith, they would never forget their lineage. This cultural resilience extended into the arts and sciences. The intricate geometric patterns of Islamic art found a natural ally in the ancient Persian love for symmetry and floral abstraction. The mathematical brilliance of the Greeks and the observational rigor of the Persians merged in the house of wisdom, fueling the Islamic Golden Age. From medicine to astronomy, the intellectual lineage of the Sassanids flowed directly into the veins of the new Islamic civilization. The conquest had broken the sword of Persia, but it had failed to break its pen. The empire had been replaced, but the culture had become universal. Persia had ceased to be a mere territory on a map and had become a way of life, a sophisticated, aesthetic, and intellectual framework that would eventually stretch from the borders of India to the gates of Anatolia. The skin had changed, but the heartbeat remained unmistakably, unyieldingly Persian. 750 CE. The bustling marketplaces of Baghdad and the scholarly halls of Khorasan. The dust of the great conquests had finally begun to settle, But what emerged from the wreckage was not a graveyard of a dead civilization, but a vibrant, hybridized world. The political map had been redrawn, and the temples of the old gods were falling silent, yet the ghost of Persia was everywhere. It was a quiet, intellectual conquest, one where the conquered became the masters of the conqueror's mind. This phenomenon is often called the Persianate transformation. While the Arabic language became the sacred vehicle for the Quran and the legal language of the Caliphate, it could not claim dominion over the complexities of high administration or the intricacies of statecraft. The early Islamic rulers, realizing that an empire of such vastness could not be governed by zeal alone, turned to the very people they had defeated to build their new world. The Persian Diwan, the sophisticated system of bureaucracy, taxation, and record-keeping, became the backbone of the Abbasid Caliphate. The conquerors provided the faith, but the Persians provided the structure. This administrative integration paved the way for a profound cultural osmosis. In the courts of the new caliphs, the etiquette, the courtly manners, and the very concept of kingship were heavily modeled after the Sassanid tradition. The king of kings may have been gone, but the idea of the just ruler and the majesty of the imperial court survived, translated into a new Islamic context. Nowhere was this survival more miraculous than in the realm of language and literature. For a time, Persian was relegated to the domestic sphere, a language of the home and the hearth. But it did not wither. Instead, it underwent a metamorphosis. As the centuries progressed, the Persian language began to absorb the Arabic script and vocabulary, creating a new, rhythmic, and incredibly flexible medium. This was the birth of New Persian. It became the language of the soul. Through the medium of poetry, the Persian identity achieved a form of immortality that no army could touch. When the great poets began to write, they were not merely composing verses. They were engaging in an act of cultural preservation. In the epic tradition, most notably through the monumental work of Ferdowsi, the history, the heroes, and the linguistic essence of ancient Iran were rescued from the brink of oblivion. By using the new Persian tongue to tell the old stories, these poets ensured that even as the people embraced a new faith, they would never forget their lineage. This cultural resilience extended into the very heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the sciences. The intellectual lineage of the Sassanids flowed directly into the veins of the new civilization. In the great libraries and the house of wisdom, the mathematical brilliance of the Greeks merged with the observational rigor and astronomical traditions of the Persians. From the medical encyclopedias of Avicenna to the advanced algebra that would change the world, the Golden Age was, in many ways, a Persian-flavored Renaissance. The conquest had broken the sword of Persia, but it had failed to break its pen. The empire had been replaced, but the culture had become universal. Persia had ceased to be a mere territory on a map and had become a way of life, a sophisticated, aesthetic, and intellectual framework that would eventually stretch from the borders of India to the gates of Anatolia. The skin had changed, but the heartbeat remained unmistakably, unyieldingly Persian. 800 CE. The lecture halls of Baghdad and the quiet observatories of Isfahan. If the previous era was defined by the survival of the Persian soul through poetry and administration, this era marks its profound intellectual ascent, a journey that would eventually bridge the gap between the ancient East and the burgeoning Renaissance of the West. To understand the lasting impact of Persian thought, we must look beyond the borders of the Caliphate and into the very architecture of human logic and ethics. The Persian contribution to the world was not merely a collection of facts, but a way of perceiving the universe. This began with the metaphysical seeds planted by Zoroastrianism thousands of years prior. The ancient Persian concept of a Shah, the cosmic order, truth, and righteousness, and its eternal struggle against drudge, the lie and chaos, provided a moral framework that resonated far beyond the Zagros Mountains. This dualism, the cosmic battle between light and darkness, found its way into the bloodstream of Western thought, influencing the ethical structures of monotheistic traditions and the philosophical debates of the Middle Ages. The idea that the universe was not a chaotic accident, but a moral battlefield governed by divine law, was a Persian gift to the human consciousness. As we move into the height of the Islamic Golden Age, this ethical foundation met the rigor of Greek logic. This was the great synthesis. In the libraries of the East, Persian scholars did not just translate the works of Aristotle and Plato, they interrogated them. They took the abstract reasoning of the Greeks and infused it with the practical, observational wisdom of the Persian tradition. Consider the giants of this era, such as Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna. He was the heir to a lineage of Persian medical and philosophical excellence. His canon of medicine became the standard textbook in European universities for centuries. When a student in Montpellier or Bologna studied the nature of the soul or the mechanics of the human body in the 13th century, they were, in essence, studying the distilled wisdom of Persia. Avicenna's ability to harmonize Aristotelian logic with metaphysical inquiry provided the intellectual scaffolding upon which the Western scholastic movement would later be built. This influence was not limited to the sciences. The Persian concept of adab, a sophisticated blend of ethics, etiquette, and literature, redefined what it meant to be a civilized human being. It taught that knowledge was not merely for utility, but for the refinement of the character. This ideal of the polymath, the individual who masters both the sword and the pen, the mathematics of the stars and the nuances of poetry, became the archetype for the Renaissance man. The ripples of this thought traveled through the Silk Road, through the Crusades, and via the translations in Toledo, eventually reaching the minds of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. The Persian emphasis on empirical observation, the systematic categorization of knowledge, and the pursuit of a just, cosmic order provided the tools that the West would eventually use to emerge from its own dark ages. We see now that the history of Persia is not a closed loop of fallen empires. It is a continuous, flowing river of ideas. The conquests may have changed the masters of the land, but the intellectual DNA of the ancients remained. Persia did not just influence the world. It provided the very language of reason and morality that allowed the modern world to begin its journey. 2024. The high plateaus of Iran, where the wind carries the scent of dry earth and ancient memory. We have journeyed through the rise and fall of titans. We have stood in the shadow of Persepolis, felt the thunder of Alexander's cavalry, and walked the gilded halls of the Sasanians. We have seen empires built on stone and blood, only to see them crumbled by the relentless march of time. To the casual observer, the story of ancient Persia might seem like a tragedy of endings, a series of magnificent collapses. But to look at Persia through the lens of conquest alone is to miss the heartbeat of the civilization itself. History tells us that empires die. They are swallowed by the desert, overwritten by new languages, and buried under the strata of newer conquests. Yet, Persia presents us with a profound paradox, a civilization that was conquered but never truly defeated. It is a culture that mastered the art of the metamorphosis. When the political structures of the Achaemenids fell, the Persian spirit retreated into the language. When the Sasanians were swept aside by the Arab conquests, the Persian soul migrated into the architecture of the mind. This is the eternal spirit of the Iranian identity, a refusal to be erased. It is found in the way the Persian language became the courtly tongue of the very caliphates that had once been its rivals. It is found in the way the aesthetics of the Sassanid court flowed into the intricate geometries of Islamic art. It is found in the way the ancient concept of a Shah, the cosmic truth, was woven into the moral fabric of a new world. Persia did not exist as a static monument, but as a living, breathing organism that learned to survive by changing its skin. It became the bridge between the ancient and the modern, between the East and the West. It was the vessel through which the wisdom of the Greeks was preserved, refined, and handed back to a burgeoning Europe. It was the intellectual engine of the Silk Road, ensuring that while kings might fall, the flow of human knowledge would remain uninterrupted. When we look at the world today, in the poetry that moves our hearts, in the mathematics that governs our technology, and in the very philosophical foundations of our ethics, we see the ghost of Persia. We see a civilization that understood a fundamental truth, that true power does not reside in the reach of an army or the height of a throne, but in the resilience of an idea. The empires of old are gone. Their cities are dust, and their conquerors are forgotten names in a textbook. But the Persian identity remains, an unbroken thread running through the tapestry of human history. It is a testament to the fact that a people can lose their land, their gods, and their kings, yet still retain their soul. As this documentary concludes, we do not leave Persia in the past. We find it in the continuity of human progress. We find it in the enduring belief that order can rise from chaos, that light can triumph over darkness, and that a great civilization, once ignited, can never truly be extinguished. The empires have fallen, but the spirit is eternal.